Well, hello. You'll forgive me if this is an unusual setting. I don't like to normally make videos in my car, but we're kind of between walls right now, and I'm living in an apartment with my coworker and his wife. And I just assumed they didn't know I ran a gay anarchist YouTube channel. So, um, which even though I'm not going to talk about either being gay or really strictly speaking anarchism in this video, they'd want to know, oh, let me see your channel, and I just assume my boss didn't see any of that stuff. Um, so I drove to get some food, some Chinese food, and I thought I'd make a video in the car, and then I can upload it back to the apartment, no problem. Um, so part of my never-ending quest, really, one of the most interesting things for me in terms of study is trying to understand uh, where libertarianism comes from, what are the characteristics, and are they genetic? Are they cultural? If so, where? Uh, Mostly because I just find it interesting, but also practically speaking, it would be really good if we could find out what it is that makes people more receptive to liberty, and then we would, ideally try and perpetuate whatever that is. And there's, I've thought about it in every angle, and the bottom line is there isn't a ton of really evidence, and even in the areas that there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, I don't think you could prove it. But typically, when you look at it culturally, there's a tendency to look at Locke, look at, I don't know, the Enlightenment or the Renaissance, or maybe even some of the classical authors like Cicero or Aristotle. And that's all, good and important, and I think it's worthwhile. But I think one thing that's overlooked is the effect of the Indians or the Native Americans and their society on American society, on the transplanted European society. Now, there was a cultural exchange, sometimes called a Columbian exchange, although that's a broader term for all the exchange, potatoes and tomatoes and all that. But there was a Columbian cultural exchange that I actually think is fairly well studied among Indians. And it's pretty obvious that Indian society was changed dramatically by the contact with the Europeans. Uh, just the fact that most of them speak English exclusively. The naming conventions are English. They use English technology. They drive around in cars, on and on and on. And even before that, you go back to the 19th century, using horses, using guns, using metal tools, uh, and even the religious changes. There's a big change, and I think this has been studied because it's kind of politically correct. But I think what hasn't been studied is the fact that that cultural exchange was not one way. Indians had an effect on the Europeans who settled in America and their successor societies, and I think there's a possibility that to some degree the libertarianism in the United States can be attributed to this. To some degree. I wouldn't say that's the thing that did it, but I would say that might be part of it. And there's a couple reasons why I would say that. The first thing to realize, though, is that I think you can make a pretty strong case that the type and the degree of effect that the Indian societies had on the European societies varied tremendously. I think if you go the farther back you go, the more powerful the Indians are relative to the Europeans, and the more populous they were relative to the Europeans. And I think that means that they probably had more influence relative to their later contact. So if you look at a map, the Lakota or the Apache probably had less effect on our society. I hate the use of that pronoun, but the transplanted European society in America, the American society, than earlier, more Eastern tribes like, say, the Algonquins, the Iroquois, the Ojibwe, whatever, because they were dealing on much more equal terms, and there was a much higher degree of interaction. If you look in the 1650s, many settlers would have had dealings at some point or another, if not regularly, with Indians. But if you look at the 1850s, that would have been pretty rare. Only in a few areas was that happening. Out west on the frontier or whatever. And so that tells you that there would be less cultural exchange. Interestingly, though, the ones where there was later contact, like the Lakota and the Cheyenne and the Apache, they became much more popular in culture, in the sense that when we think of Indians, we think of teepees and Geronimo. We don't think of longhouses so much, or wigwams, or Algonquin. We think of buffalo, and that's accurate for that period and for those groups, but not accurate for the Indians in the Northeast or the Southeast. But I would argue that the Algonquins especially, and the Iroquois also, had a fairly strong influence. Now, Russell Means, who is a very interesting figure, who I think actually epitomizes what I'm talking about here. Most of you have probably seen or heard of him. He was in a few movies, and the best one, I think, the most famous probably, he was Chingachgook in The Last of the Mohicans, which is interesting because that is a movie that actually I think also is illustrating what I'm talking about. And what's interesting about Russell Means, though, is that he is a Native American activist, and he actually ran for the Libertarian presidential nomination, and he lost to Ron Paul. And the one criticism I heard Means make of Paul is that he was not, quote, the A word, which I can only assume means anarchist. So Russell Means, as far as I can tell, is a libertarian anarchist. Now, I'm actually going to attach this video as a response to one of his. I don't know if he actually ever approves responses. I don't know if he'll ever even seen it. But if he doesn't, that's fine. Look him up. He has his own YouTube channel where he talks, and he talks about a lot of things not strictly political, but he is definitely a libertarian, and he does. And I didn't get this from him, but he does actually talk about what I'm talking about. He specifies that he believes the 5 or the 6 nations that changed names, the Longhouse, the Iroquois League, is the prototype of the U.S. Constitution. Now, I've heard that before, and I'm not enough of an expert. In fact, I'm not an expert at all on the Iroquois League. I mean, at least its formal legal doctrines. I know some of its history. I know a lot about the history, say, in the Revolutionary War, the French and Indian War. I know about Waragayege. I've heard of Hiawatha. I can name the 5 or the 6 nations depending on which one, but I don't know the details about their league. So I don't know how true that is. But what I do think is, and what got me thinking about this was actually the play The Crucible, which is fiction, basically. It's about the Salem witch trials, but there's a scene in there where one of the Puritan girls is basically threatening another girl, and she says, "You better not cross me, because I will do whatever I want against you, because I remember I watched my mother and father get their brains bashed in when I was a little girl." Now, I'm not saying this to point out the violence so much as to say that girl was not an English woman anymore. She had experiences that no English person would have, and I would generalize. The Americans have totally different experiences than Englishmen, and I think this is true today, and my English subscribers will probably agree, or I've asked them and they've said it's true, that Americans are not Englishmen, and Americans are not German, and Americans are not French, or Americans are not Europeans. They are different. Now, they came from Europe, so either they're a subset of the population of Europe that when it grows out is so different, or they changed. And I think it's both, actually. And I think the Indians had a big part in that. The Indians in Mesoamerica obviously had all kinds of different societies. And if you look down in Mesoamerica with the Aztec or the Maya or the Inca, who are the real famous ones, they definitely were not anarchists. They definitely had states. Now, our understanding of those states is not bad, but not super detailed. But they definitely had hierarchical states. But if you look in the United States, the continental United States, things that we could clearly identify states are pretty rare, and it's debatable in most cases. Now, I've heard, when you read about DeSoto going through the Southeast, some of the things he encountered, you can kind of see perhaps as being states. And you look at like the ruins, like it's say Cahokia, or maybe in the Southwest, you might say maybe there are states there, although I don't think we could really say with the Anasazi. But by the time the Europeans actually settled there, all the Indians that DeSoto was talking about were dead. I mean, there was clearly a wave of plagues that went through, that we have no record of because it happened before Europeans were here taking notes. And whatever societies existed there previously were radically different, if not completely extinct, by the time South Carolina becomes a colony or Georgia becomes a colony. But in the Northeast, which I think are the groups that had the most influence on the United States, the Algonquins and the Iroquois, they were pretty much anarchists, and for most of them, it's pretty explicit. There's really not much. There's not really any other conclusion you could take. There's a tendency to look at things like chiefs and kind of imagine them as kings or proto-kings or as proto-states. There's a tendency to look at the individual tribes as states. Now, that's not a very accurate or descriptive adjective to use. They almost certainly were not. And the chiefs were more like natural elites. They were people who earned the respect of others, and so they would be listened to. But they did not have legislative power. They couldn't just come and say, "Well, I'm the chief, so now half the maidens are indebted to me, or everyone owes me half of their whatever winter harvest or whatever." They couldn't tax and say, "I get half the corn," or "I get all the venison," or like. They were just, if people would talk to them, and since they were considered worthy people might emulate them or might follow their lead. They might be leaders in war. They might be leaders in disputes. They would probably be some type of arbiter. And that's it. They weren't kings and they weren't legislators. And they had to win by consent. And this is really clear in war. There's actually a couple of accounts I've read where the French are talking with their Algonquin allies, and the Algonquins say, it's different with you. With you, the French, the king tells the king tells the governor to do something, and he has to do it, and the governor tells his subordinates, and they have to do it. With us, it doesn't work that way. If the chief tells someone to do something that's crazy, they're just not going to do it, and that's it. He can just go and say, you know what, screw that. And that meant that they were much more cautious, and they didn't. When it came to military affairs, they would not throw their lives away so wantonly. They were not wasteful in that area, and this is actually one area where the Columbian Exchange is understood the other way, because many of the Americans who fought in the Revolution took Native American Indian military tactics. They said, well, why? Not all of them. It would be wrong to say the American Revolution was fought with Indian tactics. That would not be correct. But many of the commanders and many of the militias and many of the soldiers did, because they had faced them in the French and Indian War. They were effective, and they emulated them. And it was crazy not to. The idea, there's a scene in The Patriot where Mel Gibson says something to the effect that it's crazy. Let's just get in a field and line up and start shooting at redcoats. Like, that's nuts. That's just insane. Even if you had an army that was as good as the redcoats, that would be insane. It would much better to go and jump behind a tree. And I actually remember reading, there's a famous example of Braddock. Braddock was a British general in the French and Indian War who launched a large assault against Fort Duquesne, which is now Pittsburgh, early in the conflict. And it was largely considered, well, this is going to be it. He's going to go and push the French right out of the Ohio. And the French were terrified, and they almost gave up, but the Indians, one of the Frenchmen and the Indians were like, well, we should fight. And they ended up annihilating Braddock's force, more or less. And not annihilating, because some of them survived, but pretty much. And during the battle, a lot of the Americans broke ranks and started shooting from behind trees and stumps, and the British officers actually either shot them or at least ordered them to say, hey, you have to fight like soldiers. And they're like, well, if that means we're going to die like idiots. But that, I think, is a Native American influence. And I think it goes more than that. There's a certain liberty to being a Native American. I don't like it. I'm going to move to another town. I don't like the people here, the government. I'll just leave. I'll do my own thing. I'll set up my own place. You know, I'll go live with my family here or there. And this is something that is really unusual in Europe. And I think that it had an effect. If you read a book called The Black Robe, which there's a movie called The Black Robe, and the movie is actually fairly true to the book. But the book, it's about a Jesuit missionary in the Great Lakes in the mid 1600s. And I don't think you see it in the movie, but in the book he talks about how, you know, this is a guy who was raised in France, and then he goes out here, and it's just totally different. You know, the French fur traders are basically completely free. I mean, they can do whatever they want. And in the book, it kind of uses sexual immorality as kind of the sign of this, that they just go around having sex with as many women as they please all the time. And, you know, obviously this puritanical Catholic finds that bad. But I think it's much deeper than that. You know, and I hate the examples I'm using are of violence and of polygamy, but those are just examples. I think that there was an influence. I think that there was, I mean, there's a good book. It's called The Middle Ground. It's about the Upper Great Lakes. I read it because I'm from Michigan, and it's not written from a libertarian perspective, because there are very, very few books written from a libertarian perspective. But they talk about how the Indians really wanted to be free, and when you would come, the French were always trying to get the Indians to be subjects. They wanted to get them in a position where if the governor of Canada told the Indians that they had to attack the British, they would just do it. That's what they wanted. That was the policy that they tried to foster, and they failed. Because the Indians could sense it, you know, even if they didn't overtly, even if the governor of France wouldn't overtly say, listen, I need you to be my subordinates, I need you to obey me, the implications of the things he would ask, like, I need you to promise to go to war if I tell you need to go to war. They would say, well, we can't do that. We don't know if that would be in our interest. And the relationship with the governor of New France, of Quebec, was not really an antagonistic one. He was considered a father. I believe the word was onantio. I'm probably saying that wrong. You know, you read this in a book, you don't know how it sounds, but he was someone like a big chief, but he could not order them to do anything. And they wouldn't do it if they thought it was against their interests. And that meant that they didn't sell their lives cheaply. And, I mean, you can see this in the American Revolution. You know, a lot of Americans sat out the American Revolution. He's like, why should we go fight and die? We don't, you know, either they don't have a dog in this fight or they don't see the point. And that strikes a lot of us today as, oh my gosh, they're not being good nationalists. And I'm thinking they're being perfectly rational now. You know, why should they go and die if they don't see it in their own interest? If they do see it in their own interest, then good. Good luck to them. They're fighting for their freedom. They should be blessed. You know, and they're pretty cool for doing that. But if they decide it's not in their interest or it's against their religion, like many of the Quakers felt, you can't really fault that. You can't say, oh no, they were. And so I think this is an area that needs to be studied and analyzed more. That, you know, and I'm not calling for like some university to do it. I know that sociology students or whatever in universities are just going to be Marxists, and I know when they look at comparative societies, they just look for proofs that communism is awesome. Which, by the way, when I reference Russell Means, everyone should go on Scott Horton's show. If you type Scott Horton show on YouTube or on Google, you'll find it. It's got a dark green background with white lettering, and he has a whole list of interviews. And look up the Russell Means interview. There's only one, and I think it's from 2007. And that's a very, very interesting interview, because the libertarian kind of cliche of the Native Americans is, they're all on welfare, they all live on these reservations, and they get government subsidies. Russell Means, he's a really smart guy. He knows what he's talking about, and he kind of explodes that, saying, well, actually, the government owns those lands in trust. He goes, the Indians own it, but the federal government holds it in trust. And you can't do anything on a reservation without Uncle Sam's say-so, which is why they suck so much, which is why they're terrible. Unless you can get the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who is John McCain, I think, or at least it used to be, you can't do anything. And that's disgusting. I mean, good luck even getting an audience with His Majesty, let alone convincing him to allow you to, I don't know, build a farm or a factory or what else. He says that they basically pretty much only allow you to build casinos, and they like farming and ranching because they think that's the quaint thing Indians should do. Anyway, that's a great interview. Check out Russell Means. Not everything he talks about is strictly speaking related to libertarianism, but he's definitely a libertarian, and it's a perspective that's definitely unique. And if he can run against Ron Paul and call him out for not being an anarchist, he's pretty serious then. So anyway, let me know what you think. It's my feeling that there's something to this, that there is a Native American influence on American libertarianism, on American cultural generally. I remember a long time ago I went to a protest, and there are all these Marxists there, and it was ironic because I was wearing a anti-gun control shirt. It's a picture of Hitler, and it says, all in favor of gun control, raise your right hand. It's a great shirt put out by the Jews for the preservation of firearm ownership. Anyway, there was this Latino girl there, Marxist Latino girl, who was wearing a shirt that had a famous picture of Geronimo and like 10 of his braves, and they're all standing up on top of a cliff, and they all got their Henry repeating rifles. And she came at me and was like, oh, real men don't have guns. I'm like, oh, you mean like the real men on your shirt? Like the brave men who stood up against the United States government for I don't know how many decades against overwhelming odds? For good reason, those aren't men? Obviously, she was an idiot because she was a Marxist, and she just didn't... I think she shut up as soon as I said that. She hadn't realized what she was wearing. Of course, she was just I'm going to tell everyone else here that they're a fascist mode. But anyway, let me know what you think. I think it's a pretty interesting area of study. I've had some requests. Some people want me to talk about some other things. The Scythians, Sumerians, the Dutch, the Spanish, the English, and the French. Definitely the Dutch is something I know quite a bit about. I read a 1,400-page book on the Dutch Republic about 2 years ago or 3 years ago. There's a lot of interesting things there about capitalism, and there's a lot of interesting things juxtaposing the Spanish exploitation of the New World and the English exploitation of the New World. And I think that's pretty relevant because you still see a huge difference between the Latin and the Anglo, so-called, societies in North and South America right now. And I think that there are actually, well, just to make a long and short of it, people always point to East Germany and West Germany, North Korea and South Korea to point out the differences between capitalism and socialism. I would say look at Mexico and the United States, or the United States and Latin America, and then you get a better idea of the idea between a free market and sheer mercantilism. Anyway, I'll make another video about that at some point. I don't know when. I think I'm going to get busy with work soon. But I just thought I'd make this and put it out there. So, all right, cheers. Talk to you later.